The night was thick with the scent of rain, the streets glistening under flickering streetlights. Shadows stretched across the pavement, and the air held a quiet tension, like a storm waiting to break. Jason Kane walked through the alley, his boots crunching against the wet ground. His face was hard, worn by years of struggle. A scar ran across his jaw, a reminder of battles fought and won. His hands stayed loose by his sides, ready. He knew this night would come. From the opposite end of the alley, Victor Rains emerged. The gang leader carried himself like a king without a throne, his eyes cold and calculating. The streetlights flickered over his bruised knuckles. People lurking in the shadows shrank back, their whispers swallowed by the night. Everyone knew what Victor was capable of. But tonight, he wasn't facing a helpless target. He was facing Jason. Their eyes locked, either man blinking. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. Then, without warning, Victor lunged. Jason barely dodged the first punch before countering with a sharp jab to the ribs. Victor grunted but swung again, his fist slamming into Jason's jaw. The taste of blood filled Jason's mouth, but he didn't step back. The fight was brutal. Fists flew, bones cracked, and blood splattered onto the pavement. Each hit was precise, fueled by years of anger. Jason could feel Victor slowing, his breathing ragged. The moment was coming. Then, Jason faked left and slammed his fist into Victor's stomach. The gang leader gasped, his body buckling. Jason tackled him to the ground, pinning him. Their eyes met again, but this time, Jason held the power. He leaned in, his voice low. Victor lay on the ground, gasping for air, his hands clutching his ribs. Jason stepped back, fists still clenched, his breath coming in short bursts. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. Around them, the alley was silent. The gang members who once followed Victor stood frozen, their loyalty cracking. Jason knew fear when he saw it, and right now, they were afraid not just of him, but of what came next. Victor wiped the blood from his lip, forcing a smirk. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was hoarse, but the arrogance still clung to it. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he watched as Victor struggled to sit up, his body shaking from the beating. "You don't get it, do you?" Victor spat, glaring up at him. "There's someone bigger than me pulling the strings. You think I'm in charge? I'm just another piece on the board." Jason's jaw tightened. He had suspected there was more to this. Victor ran the streets, but someone else was feeding the machine, keeping the system alive. Jason had spent years fighting the symptoms, but now he needed the cure. A slow clap echoed from the alley's entrance. Jason turned, his muscles tensing. A man in a sleek suit stepped forward, his polished shoes untouched by the filth around him. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of power. Councilman Richard Hayes. "Impressive," Hayes said, glancing at Victor before looking at Jason. "But you're asking the wrong questions. This fight? It was never about him." Jason's fists tightened again, but this was different. Hayes wasn't some street thug. He was the kind of man who never got his hands dirty, he had others do it for him. "You have two choices, Jason," Hayes continued. "Walk away and let things be, or step into a war you're not ready for." Jason exhaled slowly. His choice was clear. "I don't walk away." Hayes smiled. "Then you just made your biggest mistake." Jason stood in the dimly lit parking garage, his pulse steady, his eyes locked on the man in front of him. Councilman Richard Hayes leaned against the hood of a black luxury car, adjusting his cufflinks like this was just another business deal. Behind him, two bodyguards stood silent, their hands resting near their holsters. Jason knew this wasn't just a warning, this was a test. "You don't waste time, do you?" Jason said, his voice calm but firm. Hayes smirked. "Neither do you. That's why we're here." He gestured toward the garage's edge, where the city skyline stretched into the night. You see all that, Jason? The lights, the businesses, the power? It all runs because of people like me. You're trying to change a system that's older than both of us. Jason crossed his arms. And you're scared because I might actually do it. Hayes chuckled, shaking his head. Scared? No. But I am concerned. He took a step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. I respect what you did to Victor. Really, I do. But you don't understand what you're stepping into. This isn't about street gangs. This is about control. Jason clenched his fists. And what happens when that control ruins lives? Hayes sighed, as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. You think you're the hero, Jason. But heroes don't last. They get crushed under the weight of their own morals. Jason stepped forward. Then let's find out how much weight I can carry. For the first time, Hayes' smirk faded. He studied Jason for a long moment before nodding slightly to one of his men. The bodyguard moved fast, reaching for his gun. Jason was faster. He knocked the weapon aside, driving an elbow into the man's ribs. The second guard lunged, but Jason ducked, sweeping his leg and sending him to the ground. Before Jason could turn, Hayes spoke. Enough. His voice was sharp, controlled. Jason froze, his instincts screaming at him to finish the fight. Hayes adjusted his suit, unfazed. You've made your choice. Now I'll make mine. He turned, stepping into his car as his guards recovered. As the engine roared to life, Hayes gave Jason one last look. You should have walked away. Jason watched as the car disappeared into the night. He knew what was coming next. And he was ready. Jason sat on the rooftop, looking down at the streets below. The city never slept, its lights flickering like stars trapped on the ground. He had spent years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, but tonight, something felt different. The battle with Hayes wasn't just about taking down corruption anymore, it was personal. A faint shuffle behind him made Jason tense. He turned, already knowing who it was. Maria stood there, arms crossed, her face tight with concern. You're thinking about going after him alone, she said. Jason exhaled. I have to. If I don't stop him now, he'll keep coming. Maria stepped closer, her voice low but firm. And if you lose? If he buries you like he did everyone else? Jason shook his head. Then someone else picks up the fight. She studied him for a long moment. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. You won't have to do it alone. Jason frowned. What's this? Proof. Every dirty deal, every bribe, every name tied to Hayes. I got it from someone on the inside. Jason's jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I knew you'd rush in without a plan. Maria's eyes softened. You're not just some guy throwing punches in the dark, Jason. You're smarter than that. Use this. Expose him the right way. For the first time that night, Jason hesitated. He wanted to end this with his fists, but Maria was right. Hayes thrived in the shadows. Beating him wasn't just about fighting harder. It was about hitting where it hurt most. Jason clenched the flash drive in his palm. This changed everything. The war wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. Jason stood in the dimly lit warehouse, his fists clenched. Across from him, Hayes smirked, his expensive suit barely wrinkled. Behind him, two armed men stood like statues, waiting for a command. The air was thick with tension. I have to admit, Jason, Hayes said, his voice smooth, you've been a thorn in my side for far too long. But this ends tonight. Jason took a step forward. You're right. It does. He pulled out the flash drive and tossed it toward Hayes, who caught it with a frown. That's everything, Jason said. Every deal, every bribe, every crime. It's already been sent to the press. In a few minutes, your name will be everywhere. Hayes' smirk faltered. He glanced at his men, but Jason saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. You're bluffing, Hayes muttered, gripping the drive tighter. Jason tilted his head. Try me. A loud chime echoed through the warehouse. Hayes pulled out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen, and Jason knew he had seen the news. Reports were flooding in. His empire was crumbling in real time. Hayes' face twisted with rage. You think this is over? He motioned to his men. Kill him. The guards raised their guns. Jason moved first. He lunged, grabbing the nearest one's arm and twisting hard. A gunshot rang out, but it hit the ceiling. Jason drove his elbow into the man's ribs, sending him crashing to the ground. The second guard aimed, but Jason was faster. He dodged, landing a brutal kick to the man's knee. The guard collapsed with a pained shout. Hayes backed away, his confidence shattered. Jason stalked toward him. No more hiding, Hayes. Hayes grabbed a metal pipe and swung, but Jason ducked. He countered with a punch to Hayes' gut, then another to his jaw. The corrupt politician stumbled, blood dripping from his mouth. Jason grabbed Hayes by the collar. You built your power on fear, he said. Now you get to feel what it's like. Sirens wailed outside. The police had arrived. Jason shoved Hayes to the ground and stepped back. As the officers stormed in, Jason raised his hands. He had won not just the fight, but the war. The city moved fast. By the next morning, news of Hayes' arrest was everywhere. Reporters picked apart his crimes, officials scrambled to distance themselves, and his once loyal allies vanished. The man who had controlled everything was now just another criminal in handcuffs. Jason stood outside the police station, watching as detectives loaded boxes of evidence into cars. It was over. He should have felt relief, but instead, there was only exhaustion. Not bad, a voice said behind him. Detective Cole stood there, arms crossed. You did what we couldn't. Jason gave a small nod. It had to be done. Cole studied him. So what now? Jason looked out at the city. I don't know. But I'm not running anymore. A few weeks later, life started to settle. The streets were calmer, safer. The fear that had once gripped the city had loosened. Jason had no interest in fame, no desire for thanks. He just wanted peace. One evening, he stood on his rooftop, feeling the cool night breeze. The fight was over. For the first time in years, he let himself breathe.